Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I've been asked to speak today about the future of language services in the age of technological disruption. So what I'll do is give everyone a brief overview of the history of machine translation and where this technology may be going in the future. Then I'll move on to some technologies that are disrupting the interpretation industry as well. So really over the past couple of years, you couldn't attend a conference about translation services without getting a earful about artificial intelligence and machine translation and how this technology is on the verge of completely overturning traditional human-led language services. Now, I have attended events recently where a term was thrown around, human-assisted translation. So instead of talking about machine-assisted translation, it's human-assisted now because machines will take the lead. That's the concept that people are entertaining. So interestingly enough, though, technological disruption doesn't really seem to affect interpretation as such. Everyone's talking about how it disrupts translation. And the reason behind this is that this is an area where we can bring in technology much more easily, but I'll talk about both areas. So first, machine translation, like Bitcoin, was only popularized about 2 years ago, but the history of it can actually be traced back to a Soviet scientist in 1933. So at the time, this scientist used nothing but some paper cards, a typewriter, and a film camera, and he essentially created a very crude automated dictionary. But the arms race, I can say, for machine translation didn't really start until IBM, at the dawn of the Cold War in 1954, used a computer to translate 60 Russian sentences into English. But these were very carefully curated Russian sentences, and it made the machine translation more accurate than normal. But driven by the Cold War and the country's desires to really spy on each other and decode each other's intelligence, scientists in the US and Russia just dove into machine translation. So mainly the work was done in English and Russian. So first we had rule-based machine translation, which really attempted to automatically translate sentences using grammatical rules in English and Russian. And so this was the focus of the attempts over the next 30 years. The concept was good, but it proved nearly impossible to program every single rule of the languages involved. Not to mention we have factors that are not logical because we have influences in language from human culture, history, and superstition. Starting in the 1980s, Japan changed the whole industry by introducing example-based machine translation. It turned out you didn't really need to feed the computers all the rules of a language. You just had to feed example translations, and by allowing the machine to naturally develop associations between all these example sentences, you can have a pretty good machine translation engine. And the larger amount of data you feed it, the more accurate it became. So example-based machine translation eventually evolved into something that people are more familiar with called statistical machine translation. Computers were able to translate languages without learning about the grammatical rules in any language. They just needed examples and statistics. But this was the main form of machine translation all the way up to year 2016. But the problem with statistical machine translation was that sometimes you have examples of sentences translated one way many times, but it wasn't necessarily accurate. One example was titles of films and songs, which were converted into other languages, and quite often the meaning had nothing to do with the source language. For example, the Chinese film translation for Mission Impossible is roughly spies among spies. And this was largely due to the theme of the first movie. So under statistical machine translation, next time the phrase an impossible mission comes up, theoretically, statistical machine translation could translate that into Chinese as spies among spies, which will be entirely inaccurate. So in 2016, Google changed the game again by announcing neural machine translation. And this is a topic we explored earlier on today. And the general principles behind it is that the meanings carried by the text will be converted to a set of specifications. What I mean by this is that, for example, the word king could contain characteristics such as male, royalty, dominance. And these meanings or specifications would then be converted to a target text that contains the same characteristics. Interestingly enough, if you take the characteristics of the word king and combine that with the word female, you will get something very similar to the specifications of the word queen. So this is just a general idea behind how neural-machine translation came to be. And of course, in order to decipher these complex ideas, it became very, very difficult and resource heavy. And this is where something called deep learning came in. I'm not going to go into the specifics of neural-machine translation and deep learning, but just to tell everyone that this is where neural-machine translation is today. So why is so much research funding injected into machine translation? So aside from the obvious military applications and the drive behind how machine translation developed over the years, since the years of the Cold War, which is intelligence and spying, an obvious answer to this is the huge potential B2C market. A translation engine that is practical enough without human interference and it works well can then be marketed to every single human being around the world that either that travels for work or for pleasure, and it helps them break these cultural and language barriers. And it will become completely unnecessary to learn a foreign language if this engine works well. Native languages can then flourish. They don't have to be superseded or overridden by English or Spanish or Chinese. A universal translator app would be on all of our mobile phones, and everyone will use it as frequently as, let's say, their calculators or calendars. And not to mention, these engines will collect a huge amount of data, which then can be used by marketing companies or for different research purposes. So that's why tech giants like Google, Amazon, Facebook are investing so much money into neural machine translation, and they're hungry for the data. The current deep learning process still requires the processing of bilingual text. They need text in 2 languages in order for their engines to learn. And this is why now these tech companies are offering machine translation for so cheap a price. You can pay, for example, $20 to $30 for 1 million words to be translated by machine translation because they're so hungry for the data. So it's obvious that neural machine translation is actually being developed not to really help translators do their work. In fact, everyone's talking about how this technology would actually undermine translators. Yet, some translators also see opportunity, the ability to become more productive while aided by machine translation. So of course, their work model would change. They will be almost doing more post-editing than actual translation. And of course, companies that run translation services can cut costs by offering post-editing services rather than the traditional translation and proofreading services. So this is a shift. Recently, the American Translators Association released a draft position paper, so outlining their position on machine translation, and it's a very similar dialogue. They agree that neural machine translation is here to stay. It can aid translators, but the work is not complete without the assistance of human translators. So let's move to interpretation. There isn't so much technological disruption in the field of interpretation. Well, because maybe all it takes is a taking like a machine translation engine and then adding a text to speech software to it for it to read out the text. Maybe that's all it takes. But I don't know if how many people are aware of this. But at the 2018 session of a forum meeting in China, an ambitious Chinese company named Tencent attempted to use artificial intelligence-powered real-time simultaneous interpretation, and it didn't go well for them. There were a lot of mistakes made, and basically they became a laughingstock in the interpreting world by even trying to attempt this, and day 2 of the conference, they were replaced by human interpreters. But, it's just there to demonstrate that artificial intelligence is not ready to replace humans, And because when humans give speeches, they make grammatical errors and they introduce accents. And these are things that machines cannot really analyze and process because these are human errors. And currently they require humans to basically correct these errors in their heads before interpreting out the meanings of the texts. Now, what I'm thinking though is that where technology can help conference interpreters is to, let's say we have a auto translation engine displayed in front of interpreters, and this engine is able to recognize the speech given by the speakers, and it can display an automatic translation as the speaker is speaking out his words. This may be a very inaccurate process, but I think to a degree it may help conference interpreters do their work by showing them automatically some difficult to interpret technical terms or idioms. Of course, you can't take the translation at face value, and there is a degree of processing involved where the conference interpreter has to decide what information to keep and what information to omit, but it may help interpreters to a degree, and this is where I think this technology may be helpful. In fact, a few years ago, when Google was developing their Google Glass technology, I was really excited. I thought this may be a medium where this technology can be realized, but unfortunately, I think Google stopped putting research funds into this technology. So overall, there are many language professionals who are averse to technology. They claim that whether it's machine translation or post-editing or a speech-to-text machine translation engine, really only distract them from doing their actual work. Now, indeed, everyone's comfort level with technology is different, and these methods and tools aren't for everyone. But one thing is for sure, our industry is certainly being disrupted by technology, and artificial intelligence, neuro-machine translation, deep learning, all these concepts backed by heavy research funding by these tech giants are here to stay. Eventually, we'll find a new equilibrium. Now, whether it's computer-assisted translation or human-assisted translation, technology is here to stay, and it will continue to be an integral and deeply entrenched part of how language solutions will be offered. The future is here, and we should all be ready for it. Thank you.